to be about growing herbs. Another one of those kind of quintessential summer crops that tends to be planted at the same time as we plant a lot of our other vegetables and so forth. So we'll talk about those today and some of the issues that we run into with them. I will share that I am still kind of a beginner when it comes to herb growing. I very traditionally have planted basil and rosemary and thyme and some of those other quintessential herbs. However, when it comes to some of the other herbs that are out there, I'm still learning how to grow them, especially growing them with some troubleshooting, if you will, in our Midwestern planting zone 5B. So I know a lot of folks have a lot more experience sometimes than I do when it comes to growing herbs and also using herbs. So a bit about me for those that have joined this as your first webinar. I'm a local foods and small farms educator with University of Illinois Extension, and I cover Daviess-Stephenson and Winnebago counties. These are in northern Illinois. They all touch the Wisconsin state line. One of ours touches Iowa State. My programming area is mostly in soil and soil management, and this also includes working with commercial and non-commercial fruit and vegetable growers. So this is those that sell at a farmer's market, an orchard, as well as I work a lot with homeowners, community gardens, and backyard production. I do a lot in insect and disease management, diagnosing, trying to help you figure out some of your problems. And for the last 4 years, I've been working in fruit tree pruning, specifically on apples. I really have a growing need for that in northern Illinois. One of the things that is going to be pretty relevant today is that I am speaking from a place of planting zone 5B. So our last spring frost is around mid-May. You may be in an entirely different planting zone and be able to overwinter some of these herbs that you are growing. For a lot of us that are growing in this planting zone 5B, when we talk about overwintering herbs, we're not going to be overwintering them in the garden. We're actually going to have to overwinter them indoors. I'll talk more about this going forward today, but just know that there is going to be some relevancy here due to our planting zone of 5B. You're sent today in your email today's presentation. So you do have those handouts, so check your email if you haven't been able to today, and you'll be able to download them. But our plan today is going to get to some of the basics of herb growing, some of which, if you've grown herbs previously, you're probably pretty familiar with. But I want to at least kind of give some of the basic kind of beginner's guide to growing herbs to those who might be new to it. This will include things like determining seeds or transplants as a better herb to grow. What might you consider when it comes to containers and growing them in containers? What are the soil, light, water needs that these herbs can sometimes require? And then the overwintering piece. What are those herbs that are available to you that can overwinter in our zone if we kind of modify and play around with it? You will also get more into herb profiles today. As you can imagine, there's a lot of herbs out there and we only have so much time. So I have tried to zero in on a number of herbs that are commonly grown in our area, as well as those that we get a lot of questions about when it comes to growing. I'll briefly mention a bit about troubleshooting. Well, there's some challenges of troubleshooting, as well as harvest will be included here too. I always try to cram a lot of information in these, and I recognize that sometimes this can be too much, but certainly I want you to have this information really to go forward with. When it comes to defining what an herb is, this is a definition that I picked up from one of our previous extension educators and specialists. And what he describes is that an herb is basically an herbaceous plant that lacks a woody stem and dies each winter. That's kind of a basic thing, is that it's going to be herbaceous, it's not going to have a woody stem, and typically it's going to be an annual. It could come back the previous year or the upcoming year, but in general it's going to die that winter. It's going to flower, it's going to produce seed that season, and then it's going to die. However, an herb can also be really any plant or plant part that has historically been used for a culinary or fragrance purpose. It is a plant that is being used in culinary dishes to enhance the flavor, to give flavor, but not necessarily be the main ingredient. When we think about something like tomatoes and mozzarella and basil, basil is there to enhance the flavor, to give it flavor to that component, compared to just it being maybe another ingredient, if you will, that might give you some nutritional value or so forth. Traditionally, herbs are of the carrot and the mint family. And this mint family of Lamiaceae includes members such as basil, oregano, catnip, rosemary, thyme. And as you think about the actual plant structure of how those look, you can kind of see some overlap with it. These mostly are tolerant of most of our cold, and they really need dry soil in order to really thrive in our conditions. This other group of carrots, which is Apiaceae, is dill, it's parsley, it's cilantro, it's fennel. It's a lot of those that have more of an upright plant structure to them. And you think about how they kind of look, they have a different structure to them. This may be pretty important going forward. As you think about growing different herbs, think about these two different families, because their needs sometimes can be different based on what their soil needs are, their light needs, and so forth. Beyond kind of those basic definitions of what is an herb, some plants we consider herbs have a woody stem part. We think of rosemary and lavender, and some of those other very traditional herbs that we think of have a woody stem part to them and can overwinter well with adaptations. And now we kind of get to that place where it could just be an herb, might be one that it's a plant or a plant part that really is used in that culinary usage. This includes perennials, it includes biennials, and it includes annuals. When you look through some of the resources I'll share with you today, you will find that that definition of an herb has some roots, if you will, on more of the culinary and fragrance use, and it can be an annual or a perennial with it. When we think about herbs and growing them, most can really grow and thrive well in the summer vegetable garden. That's really where we see them just take off and really start to hit their peak when it comes to productivity. They'll yield well for you. They will sometimes take over the garden when we maybe don't want them to, but they're really going to be very happy in this summer heat that we're now really experiencing. Most are going to provide, a complement to your fresh cooking, although some might be ones that you might factor in to actually use as preservation going forward this upcoming season, especially as you're thinking of maybe foods that you're going to be preserving through canning, through drying, and so forth. You may find that you actually want to kind of balance that out and not use as much fresh, if you will. And that may be how you approach your herb growing too. It could be that you decide to grow herbs specifically that they're going to be preserved and used in food preservation. I find it's always important to really consider what your family cooks. You will find that a number of these herbs really align themselves with certain cuisines more than others. As I've shared with some of you all in webinars, my part of my family is Vietnamese, and so we cook a lot of Vietnamese food that is going to have Thai basil and lemongrass, and is going to have just all of those kind of herbaceous herbs that are very traditional to Vietnamese cuisine, compared to maybe other types of basil that would be better for using in pesto or Italian food. There's a wide range of different types of herbs out there, and they're yet again usually based on flavor and uses. When we talk about the basil plant, we're not just talking about, a traditional basil. You're going to find lots of different basils out there. The same with mints. You may find that there are different mints out there that could be used for certain roles in your cuisine and in food preservation more than others. You're also going to find a lot of cultivars and the varieties that are suited for indoors and outdoors. You may also find some that are more suited for actually growing indoors more than the others. You may also find that there can be many that can adapt to containers and potentially overwinter. There's a number of these newer cultivars and varieties that are really designed more for a container. They may be more compact, they may be more small in their stature and how they spread, and that may be where it works really well for you to do such. These can be planted continually or single planted. As we think of some of our herbs, such as cilantro or parsley, those may be good to be continually planted every 3 to 4 weeks. We compare that to maybe lavender or rosemary, where we're probably going to be okay with just 1 or 2 of those plants to provide kind of everything that you need during that season with your cooking and your food preservation. There's always going to be challenges in growing. I think that's something that we always encounter with any plant. As much as we can sometimes say that herbs are pretty easygoing when it comes to growing, they can grow pretty well for you, some can just be a little bit more finicky. I think what you are going to find is that a lot of times if you have run into issues previously when it comes to growing certain herbs, it could be based on that herb's needs. It could be that it just needs very dry soil and you're planting that herb in an area where it stays continually wet. It could be that it is an herb that needs to be planted in a container and maybe you're planting it into the soil. Some of these herbs also have invasive tendencies, and this can be during the season. However, it can also be a tendency for them to come back season after season. If you have visited our Rockford garden behind our Rockford office in Winnebago County, we have an invasion of dill. And the dill has overtaken the garden for years and years due to just a couple of plants of it being planted. If you have grown mint before, you have probably noticed that mint can spread and spread all over, and it's now become a pretty invasive issue perhaps in your growing area. Some of these also have similar disease and insect problems, and they may be the same ones that you encounter on your vegetables, as well as the same ones that might be spreading from herb to herb. And each may have very different needs. You cannot always generalize them. As much as we can say that, some of these herbs are in the same plant family, some of them still can have some challenges and some different needs when it comes to what you're growing. A lot of questions that we get are based about the overwintering and moving, say, that rosemary bush that's in the container outdoors this summer indoors this season, so then you can then bring it back out the next summer. And there can be some overwintering issues there that can be a challenge. You maybe need to have a new growing media. You maybe need to kind of change up the light source that you're giving this plant. It can be a bit of a challenge there. You also may need to continually sow throughout the season. If you're expecting to have cilantro season long, you're not going to have it with just one planting. You're really going to need to plant more cilantro on a continual basis. One of the things that I have noticed quite a bit at home and garden centers is that when I visit to look at the vegetables, there may be 45 or 50 different tomato varieties and cultivars. And yet when I go to the herbs section, there maybe is just one peppermint and one spearmint or one parsley variety and cultivar. They can be very limited in the selection that's available to you. And that's something that you may run into and encounter yourself, where you might have to visit a lot of different home and garden centers or just accept that maybe you're just going to have this one that's best for you. You may also find that some are just going to be better suited started indoors. As much as we are in the peak of summer right now, some of these still require being started indoors before planting in summer this season. And you may find that it's best right now to actually purchase these as a transplant instead of actually starting your seeds indoors and transplanting them into the garden. When we get into herb profiles, you're going to see a couple of letters. And these letters are going to correspond to kind of what this herb's needs are. I'll reiterate this as we get in there, but you notice that with transplants and seeds, I have a T and I have a DS. And so you will see that when we get into some of the herb profiles, an herb may have a T beside it. And that's to denote that this is a transplant or one that's recommended as a transplant. So yet again, you'll see this a little bit more and I'll explain a little bit more thoroughly, but I've done this so that it's a little bit easier to kind of talk about what you need to think about with each herb. I'll explain it more as we go along. For herb gardening, this may be transplants, cuttings, or seeds. Some will just be better as a seed, a cutting, a transplant. You may even find that both of them are good. You may find that some will be great for either. If you have had poor success in herb growing from starting as seeds or just overall poor performance of them, it could be that you just need to use a transplant instead. It's possible that your soil may not be warming up enough for these herbs to actually germinate and grow successfully this season. And that may be that you need to then decide to instead do some transplants and purchase transplants. Cuttings could also be a solution. You see in this photo this basil plant where they have taken a cutting of the basil and they have placed it in water, and they are kind of rerooting the basil plant before planting it into the garden. You could also do this with others such as rosemary and thyme, some of those established perennial plants where you could take a small cutting and kind of reroot them in growing media or soilless growing media mix. Basil does really well with water in this situation. And this could allow you to kind of multiply the herbs that you're growing that season, or if you have family and other family members who have some plants, you could do some cuttings with them. I'll send you some resources that go into some more detail on that. For direct seed, basil, dill, cilantro, parsley, mint, those all do pretty well from direct seeded, although you will find a lot of them as transplants currently at the home and garden centers, and could get you a leg up, if you will, when it comes to your herb growing. For plants or cuttings, those that we would traditionally see and recommend for purchase and planting, this will be thyme, oregano, rosemary, sage, lemon verbena, lavender, lemongrass. Those would all be very common ones that may have an option for cutting, or they may be fine as a transplant and kind of easy to do as a transplant. As I share with you, you will also find transplants of basil, dill, cilantro sometimes, and mint at the home and garden centers, and this can give you a couple of weeks ahead of time in herb gardening. Most of the herbs that we talk about will do great in containers if it's really given the right diameter to depth. When it comes to depth, we typically think about 6 to 8 inches. Depth is pretty good for this. That's typically what we see. As far as diameter, you might go for about 12 inches of diameter. You could probably push it at about 9 to 10 inches in diameter, but I think at 12 inches, you're going to be pretty happy with the success of the plants. One of the things that a container does great is it works really well for those herbs that tend to have invasive tendencies. It is almost an absolute commandment, if you will, of our herb gardening to plant your mint in a container. Because of its invasive tendency, having it in a container can work really well for you. It's also important that for some of these, you may find that when it comes to the overwintering options, you may be pretty limited if you weren't to grow them in a container this upcoming season. The same with indoor-outdoor. If I'm growing indoors a basil plant, I can easily move it outdoors this summer probably pretty well and grow really well for it. So for most annuals, most those that are going to just be here on a 1-year basis, a container could contain many. You could create a container that could grow many different types of herbs for you, giving them the right space that they need, and you will find maybe that that's all you need for that season. For a perennial herb, which we'll talk about today, consider maybe 1 plant per pot or 1 plant per container could work fine in that situation. Just because this is something that we want to potentially overwinter and we want to keep pretty happy with. Some of the challenges that you run into when it comes to growing herbs in containers is sometimes just poor drainage. It could be that there's just not enough drainage holes at the bottom of that pot to really allow for the container to dry out. In some of our herbs, things like rosemary, thyme, and other ones, they need very, very dry soil between watering. And you may find that growing in a container, you may have to think more about how you could address drainage. It could be that you need to move that container. It could be that you've got that container with rosemary growing beside your other vegetables and they're still getting the same amount of rainwater, and yet you're getting too much rainwater that the vegetables can thrive in it, but your herbs are not thriving in it. A growing media might also be what you need to consider when it comes to herb gardening. Many of these are what we call a soilless growing media that may have vermiculite and perlite as well as compost in it that can allow for really good drainage for those plants. If you've used growing media from the previous year and you're now using it this year, you may find that your herbs may struggle a bit. And that's an important thing to think about. If I'm growing rosemary in a container in 2019, I overwinter it and I bring it back outdoors in summer 2020, I probably need to replace that growing media because it has potentially lost some of those good qualities that can address drainage, can address fertility too. So I need to kind of repot them, if you will. A lot of growing media doesn't have fertilizer in it, and while herbs don't need a lot of fertilizer, they still may need some, which that growing media may not have. Or you may find you need to add more fertilizer. Fertilizers tend to, in containers, be lost a lot because they just, with watering, tend to lose some of the fertilizer. So the potentially sad looking plant may not be getting enough fertility with it. Watering, of course, can be an issue in containers. They tend to dry out, which is good for some of these herbs, but you may be thinking that you need to water them more frequently, and that may not be the case here. Consider also that indoor-outdoor feature. If this is something that you're going to overwinter or you're going to bring back and forth, you may want to choose a container or move into a different container when moving from indoor to outdoor. One that works outdoors might be fine for the summer, but once you move indoors, you may have to play around with that. When growing herbs in the soil, in your actual garden or in your raised bed situation, most are going to do very well with a well-drained soil with a pH range of about 6 to 7.5. We see that pretty typically for vegetables too, that's a pretty good range for them. So just a slight acidity to them. If you have a very heavy clay soil or a very continual wet soil, herbs are not where they need to be. Avoid planting them in this area. Occasionally, you may also have a really good nutrient content soil. So you have lots of good amount of nitrogen, you have phosphorus, you have potassium, you have really good organic matter through some of the soil tests you might have performed, and plants thrive well in there. You may want to avoid them for herbs, as herbs may just have a tendency to get a little bit bushy or have too much growth perhaps sometimes when it comes to kind of a higher nutrient content. Consider fertilizing sparingly, compared to maybe a vegetable garden where we might be fertilizing every 2 weeks or every week. These are ones, especially most herbs, where a balanced fertilizer like a 10-10-10 of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium could be delivered maybe once during that growing season. If it's in a container, though, you would want to do a little bit more. So maybe take half of a 10-10-10 in a liquid fertilizer and go about every 3 to 4 weeks. And that, yet again, is because containers tend to dry out pretty more infrequently compared to the soil. I still want you to think, though, that there's just different needs from herb to herb, and that's really important when it comes to having good success in growing them in the soil, is that their needs can be a little bit different. Not to say that they're challenging, but their needs can be a little bit different. For your lighting, look towards at least 6 hours of direct sunlight in order to grow well. Herbs can grow wonderful in all-day sun. That's even better situation. So it's a very sunny area of your house or your growing area. Herbs could do pretty well there. A number of my herbs are placed kind of more towards the southern part of my house, kind of right out front where we get most of the direct sunlight. But thinking of the situation, consider too in the southwestern or kind of eastern exposure will tend to do the best compared to some of the northern exposure areas. The same would be true in thinking of indoor herbs that you might be growing. Thinking about where those windows are facing would help pretty well. If you're growing indoors, you may need to enhance lighting. And when I mention this, I'm talking about kind of growing things on a windowsill or in a bay window, not necessarily talking about overwintering an herb. If you are overwintering that herb, you're taking it from the outdoors, the rosemary, the lavender, some of those other perennials, you may find that you need 10 to 12 hours of light may be needed. It can be crucial here to kind of think, yet again, every herb is a little bit different. We get this question a lot as far as, what is a shade-tolerant herb? What would be those that maybe would work pretty well in kind of a shade or really partial shade? This could be things like mint, dill, parsley, chives, lemon balm, and rosemary. All of them should be pretty good when it comes to having some shade tolerance. Not necessarily full shade, and I think you will still find the vigor might be a little bit lacking for some of them. Although I think with mint, you'll find that the vigor never ends when it grows to them. But these might be ones that are a little bit more suitable to grow. When it comes to watering the herb, each herb is just going to have different water requirements. For rosemary example, I should only be watering it when it dries out completely. So it should be very dry. Think almost sometimes like those conditions that your succulents that you might be growing indoors are dealing with. Sage is one that it should be dry, but not too dry, which is a terrible way to describe when to water. But it is one that has a different need. You compare that to things such as basil, such as cilantro, such as mint, where the watering might be pretty good for on a weekly basis. But some of those kind of woodier plants like rosemary or lavender, you may find they really need to dry out completely before doing any sort of watering for it with it. If you're doing anything indoors, as far as watering the herbs indoors, look towards when the soil feels pretty dry. And this will, of course, be factored in the amount of sunlight these herbs are getting, because they could be getting quite a lot and drying out pretty frequently here too. But root rot can be a very common problem that we see with indoor herbs, where too much water is just allowing for them to just sit in it and not really thrive. If it is an outdoor container, you may need to be watering this kind of every day. Because these are drying out so completely, you may find that you're going to have to water them pretty frequently. As much as rosemary is a dry out completely, that, based on the weather patterns, based on its container, based on what it's growing in, this may mean that it's maybe once or twice a week if it's drying out pretty well. So it can vary. Of course, certain other ones you may have to water every day. It's important to not allow the plants to wilt between watering. So be very mindful of what your plant is exhibiting, what it's kind of showing. Certainly put your fingers around the soil, see if it's dry or bare dry, and really think about that. One of the things that you may encounter or have encountered previously is that you have a great looking container and you're growing all different types of herbs. And yet you may find that the herbs that are being grown in that container have very different watering needs. And this could be the reason that you're having poor success with some of your herbs, is that you have rosemary being grown beside mint, beside basil, beside cilantro, and rosemary has a completely different water need compared to its other neighbors in that container. So if you are thinking of containers, factor in and consider what their watering needs are, because that may mean you have a much more successful container herb garden. The slide you see here gets into more about some of the spacing requirements that some of these plants have. And I include an asterisk here because sometimes it can be based on different growth of the plant itself. The spacing can sometimes be based on if you're growing them or hoping to grow them on an annual basis, or rather perennial basis. This spacing can also be based on whether you expect to harvest them at certain stages too. So that can all kind of factor in the spacing. But in general, 2 inches between each plant is what we see for something like parsley or cilantro. You of course would want to plant more than this as direct seeded, and then from there thin them out. But you will find that they can thrive pretty well in a 2 inch between plants. Parsley can grow lower than that. It can grow at about 1 inch spacing, but 2 inches would be pretty comfortable. At about 6 inches, consider chives, Chervil, as two ones that could work pretty well at the 6 inch spacing. Once you get into 10 to 12 inch category, this is oregano, this is chamomile, this is lavender, this is dill. Different cultivars and different varieties may be a little bit different though. You may find that you have a compact type of variety that could actually be spaced a little bit closer than that at maybe 8 inches. But a 10 to 12 inch would be pretty good here. Basil, we see about 12 to 24 inches. Lemon verbena, thyme, all of those would be pretty good at 12 to 24 inches. 12 being the minimum, 24 being a pretty good maximum with it. At 18 to 24 inches, so now we're at about 1.5 to 2 feet. This is things like mint, this is tarragon, this is lemon balm, and sage. All would thrive, all would do pretty well here. And then rosemary and lemongrass are about a 3-foot spacing, is what you see here. As you think about some of these then, if I had a container and I was thinking about growing rosemary, I'm probably just going to be able to get away with one rosemary plant. That container would have to be at least 6 feet long between plants. It's a pretty big container. While if you think about some of the radiuses of some of the other plants other containers you have, you might be able to kind of play around and experiment with their spacing. And I would still kind of factor in, that maybe a big container might be able to hold a basil plant, and then I could combine it with cilantro and chives perhaps around it. So maybe picking one of the big ones and then combine it with some of the smaller ones when it comes to thinking about what that container could look like. For indoor herb growing, some work great, others just don't. You will find that a lot of the kind of traditional ones that we think of, such as a rosemary or basil, cilantro, mint, they can all grow pretty well indoors. We don't always see, the big lemongrass plants indoors or some of the lavender plants indoors. It just kind of depends, but I think a lot of our summer herbs could grow pretty well for you indoors. You may also have to factor in kind of that outdoors to indoors, indoors to outdoors. And what I mean here is that you maybe are growing herbs indoors and you move them outdoors, and now they're having to kind of adjust to the new environment. And then after the end of that season, you bring them indoors again. And so you may have to kind of troubleshoot when it comes to it, because you're taking them from potentially a very nice, warm environment indoors, and now you're bringing them outside where maybe they're not as happy as they would like to be. Most of the time, you need about 6 to 8 hours of natural sunlight. And typically, south, east, west facing window is pretty good for this. Good drainage is what you're also after here. So looking towards some of those potting mixes that can really allow for the plants to get the drainage that they need, as well as to really grow and thrive. Many of the ones that work really well indoors can be basil. You could grow a bay plant, a laurel bay, or what's also called sweet bay. You could grow chervil, chives, mint, oregano, rosemary, thyme. Just lots of different ones indoors could grow and thrive really well for you. Some of which could be moved outdoors at certain times of the year, and some of which that maybe would just be fine for you just to keep growing indoors. The overwintering factor for herb gardening can sometimes be what we see when it comes to a limitation in planting zone 5. If you are in zone 6, zone 7, even if you're in, maybe join us in zone 8, you will find some pretty good success overwintering sometimes your plants outdoors in the garden. When it comes to zone 5 though, especially for us, we are typically talking about overwintering them indoors. So taking them inside with it. And some can do pretty well from season to season with some kind of protection if they're growing outdoors. But in most cases, the ones that we think about, like thyme, like rosemary, some of those other ones, we typically see them being brought indoors. You're going to see a lot of times descriptions of an herb as a perennial or a tender perennial. A tender perennial is one that typically is going to be one that we'll see grown indoors, that you'll grow outside in the summertime in a container, and then you're bringing it indoors for the winter before you bring it outdoors again. You will still also find a description sometimes of these perennial herbs that, yes, they should be great as perennials. They could grow outdoors and do great and they'll overwinter outdoors in the garden, and yet they still may not make it if we have a very hard winter. So keep that in mind when it comes to this. Each herb can be different in its needs, and it can be very different once you bring it indoors. You may find that a couple of these herbs maybe need to be in a different growing mix media, so now you grew the herb outdoors, but once you bring it in, you might consider growing it in a cacti type of mix, so replacing that growing media mix completely. You may find that a couple of these herbs have to be in a different container or really need to be in a different container because this outdoor one was more suitable for them outdoors, and now Indoors, it doesn't always make the most sense. Some may require 8 to 10 hours of light. Some may not require as much. So it can vary considerably when it comes to overwintering these. And the resources I'll share with you today go into some more details on kind of the tips and tricks. As much as it's weird to kind of be talking about this right now, it still is something for us to really consider, especially as you start thinking of growing some of these herbs, is what's really available for you to overwinter. Consider too, some of the things I've shared with you. The container choice may be suitable for outdoors. It may not make as much sense indoors for you. The growing media maybe needs to be replaced and place a new growing media in there that's just much better for an indoor use. And sometimes it's just general indoor management. Some of these will go very dormant and you may be fine just kind of providing protection and covering them in a certain part of your basement or in your garage versus one that maybe needs to be near a sunny window all winter long. So there can be some challenges here. All right, so this brings us to a number of herb profiles. So as we go along today, I'm going to try to give you some information, just some basics of these, as well as some kind of cultivars and varieties that are out there too with this as well. You will see every time I show you an herb profile, I will have certain letters at the top. So for instance, with chives, this is a perennial. It can overwinter without any sort of protection in your garden. It is one that could also be grown indoors, and it's also one that could be direct seeded. That's what those letters mean. And you'll see different letters as we go along today with that. But that's what those letters are kind of signifying. As I introduce a couple new letters, I'll also yet again kind of reiterate that. But I want you to have that just so you can kind of be able to go through these profiles. I've tried to double check everything, but you should probably also double check as well that I'm good here. So that gets us to chives then. They belong in the same family as garlic and onions. They have a very nice kind of onion flavor in the leaves. One of the great benefits with growing chives is a beautiful ornamental benefit. So having these nice ornamental grasses in the growing area that you're growing. These also tend to be very hardy. So the overwintering factor is pretty nice here when it comes to them. And they should come back season after season in our planting zone pretty well. These aren't ones that I'm expecting you to necessarily bring indoors. They also have some pretty good drought tolerance. So you may find that may be a great place for your chives to really grow. But they can have some tendencies to become invasive. And you may have to really think about how you plant these and ensure that you're kind of keeping them in place when it comes to them. There are garlic chives as well, and they have a good, more of a garlic flavor to them. You will also find that chives can eat the flowers. The flowering parts here can also have some nice flavor to them when it comes to your cooking here too. So thyme and parsley. Thyme is a perennial. You can grow it in a container. You can overwinter it with the O there. And it is one that typically you're going to see as a transplant with it. So as I mentioned containers here, I try to focus on those that need a container in order to overwinter indoors, is what I'm getting there with that C. Thyme is fairly low growing, about 6 to 12 inches in height. But it's one that you may need to do pruning if you're overwintering in the garden. So if you're in a planting zone, maybe 6 or 7, and you're overwintering it, you may find that you need to prune it a little bit every couple of years. One of the drawbacks with thyme is that it does need to be replaced every couple of years. It is one that we don't necessarily see a life of 10 to 12 years. Sometimes we see a life of thyme for about 3 to 5 years. There's a number of different types out there. The English, the lemon, the French, the citrus, as well as the woolly are those that have sometimes been recommended and ones that you may also see at home and garden centers. Parsley is one that is an annual. It can overwinter sometimes pretty well in the garden, depending on the season. And it is one that could also be grown indoors, and it also could be direct seeded or transplant. That's what that asterisk there means. Parsley is also biennial, so it is one that will actually stay around for at least 2 years. in most situations, depending, of course, on what my growing season is like. So you may have found that some parsley has kind of overwintered from summer 2019 to now summer 2020. There are two different types, the moss-colored, the flat leaf. This is also one that can grow really close together, about 1 inch. But the challenge you may run into is that the seeds can be slow to germinate. This could be that it's taking maybe 2 to 3 weeks to actually sometimes get the parsley seeds to germinate. I think you're probably good right now when it comes to the actual soil temperature that we're seeing right now. But just know that sometimes this happens and it can be a little slow to germinate, which is why you might then decide to actually purchase them as a transplant at a home and garden center. Some cultivars that I've recommended, Paramount, Peerless are those. Thyme is the plant that you see in this photo here. Lemon Verbena and Chervil. Lemon Verbena is perennial, it overwinters, and it also is one that you could do as a transplant. It can do one more that we recommend as a container, and also even kind of indoor recommended here too, because it is yet again kind of that woody shrub. But it produces really small white flowers. It's also one that is a heavy feeder of fertilizers. And you will find that that is one where if the fertilizer is there, it's gonna feed a lot. But because we're gonna try to overwinter it, it does need to be in a container. A lot of folks will use it in different kinds of drinks, flavoring lemonade, adding it to different drinks that they might be preparing. Has a really nice flavor to it. Chervil is an annual, more of a direct seeded. Typically it's similar kind of in shape to parsley. And you can actually see Chervil down here, and it looks a lot like parsley. But it has a bit more of a licorice type flavor to it. So it's not going to have that kind of traditional parsley flavor that you might. It is also one that is really quick to bolt. You know, every 3 to 4 weeks, it may send up seeds, and it may no longer be really usable and viable for you. The flavor may be very off for you because it has bolted in the situation. Both leaves and stems are used in cooking. Some of the cultivars include Crispium, Verdicissimo, and plain Chervil as one. Sage tends to sprawl when grown in the garden, and because of this, it might be that you decide to actually potentially grow it in a container, but it does need really well-drained soil if you're going to try to overwinter it. And yet again, it just may not be equipped to overwinter well in Zone 5. Because it's a perennial, because it also is one that could overwinter, and yet again, I would purchase it as a transplant in this situation. There's going to be a lot of different types of sage. You will find a purple sage that has a nice kind of purple flower quality to it. Pineapple sage is a very common one that people ask a lot of questions about and really like to grow based on its flavor. There's also tricolor and golden. If you are growing pineapple sage, know that it has to be in a container if you're going to plan to overwinter it. It is nowhere near winter hardy. While sage may be able to overwinter in the garden, you may find that for all of your sage, you might consider just growing in the container for it. Rosemary is going to be a perennial. It's going to be great to grow in a container because you're going to maybe potentially try to overwinter it. You could also grow it indoors too. It could also be a great one to grow indoors with your other herbs that you would be growing. And typically you're going to purchase it as a transplant, or you might be actually getting it as a cutting from a neighbor or someone that you know. It just does not overwinter successfully in a garden soil. And when you have some years where it does overwinter successfully when grown in the garden soil, moisture tends to be a major factor. So if we have a very wet spring, or we have a lot more snow coverage previously, you're going to find that this may affect your rosemary if it's not given much protection. And even if some protection is applied with straw mulch or something else, you may still find that the roots can be severely damaged and not bounce back as much as you want. So really think about it as a container this summer. And it's important too that there's a lot of difficulty in growing rosemary in your garden soil, putting it into a container, and then overwintering it indoors. You may have some difficulty there where it just does not spring back as much as you want. It tends to not react too well, moving from garden soil to indoor and then potentially back into the garden soil. So choose wisely. If you're growing a rosemary plant in the garden soil right now this season, you may try to overwinter it this next season with some protection this winter. But I would probably steer away from actually moving the rosemary into a container to then overwinter indoors and then back out again. If rosemary is in a container this summer, it should do pretty well going indoors already in that container. It's also one that can be pruned pretty severely to keep in shape in a container. So it can take a cutting, if you will, when it comes to actually pruning it and trying to get into a good shape that works for it. I've listed a number of cultivars here that have been recommended over time. Some of these you will find at home and garden centers, although you may not find all of them nearly as much. Oregano is perennial. It grows great in containers. It also is one that you can do pretty well in overwintering indoors. Depending on the cultivar, though, you may find it just doesn't overwinter as well in that garden situation. It could also do well indoors, and typically you're going to purchase it as a transplant or a cutting. You're not going to actually start your oregano seeds indoors. True oregano is one that's kind of the Greek type. So you will see a Greek oregano, and that is typically going to give you that oregano flavor that you're after. There is the common marjoram, and that tends to be a little bit more ornamental, tends to have a little bit of a less flavor to it as well. And yet, depending on the cultivar, it may be able to overwinter or it may not be. Yet again, depending on if you're growing in a container, if you're growing in the garden soil. If oregano has flowered, which a lot of our herbs will do, the growth tends to stop completely and it reduces flavor. The solution you could do is actually remove those flowers as they start to develop their buds, and maybe that would help get you over that hurdle of growing oregano. There's a number of different cultivars and types, such as Italian, hot and spicy, Cleopatra, which is an all-America selection, so one that has been evaluated for its quality. You will also see Mexican type of oregano, which can be used more in Mexican and Hispanic dishes. You will also see Hopley's Purple. It's another one that has been recommended. So lots of kind of different ones out there, and kind of yet again kind of more that shrub feature to it, where you may have some pretty good success in overwintering it in the garden soil, or it may just be best to have it in that container. Cilantro is typically grown as an annual. We see this direct seeded. It could thrive, it could do great indoors. You of course could also grow cilantro in a container. That would be pretty good for your plant. When we grow this plant for foliage, we're typically growing it and we're calling it cilantro. But if we were to grow this plant for the seed, we would actually be growing it for as coriander. And that would be the main difference here with both of these. It's possible you could grow both of them. I think my concern would be that if you were removing foliage, it's liable that the plant is not going to develop those seeds as fully as you would like it to. It can also be very difficult to transplant due to taproot. If you are to go to a home and garden center and you see cilantro transplants, you might steer away from them. They may not have as much success for you compared to if you were just doing them as direct seeded in the garden. Like parsley, cilantro can be planted about every 3 to 4 weeks. So it's one that you can continually kind of plant and get a really good harvest from. Most of the time, that entire plant may be harvested at really about 6 inches tall is where you could start this harvest process. There's a lot of different cultivars such as Mariano, Calypso, Confetti. You'll also see a newer one in the market called Delfino, which is an all-America selection, the AAS, which you see here. We grow a lot of cilantro in our house just because we cook a lot with it and really like the flavor of it. And I think you're going to find some really good success. It loves the hot weather. And you will find that it really takes off and grows really well for you as we get hotter and hotter this summer. Dill would be an annual. It would be potentially okay in a container. Depends on the spacing and the size of it. It's also one that could be direct seeded. You may also find that you could find a transplant of it. Most home and garden centers are going to have a transplant of it. We do not often see it grown indoors. I think that you might have some success with it. I think the issue is that it's just a big plant and it just may not provide you everything that you need for it. It usually is going to reach maturity near about 40 days. And once we hit that 40 days after direct seeding, you will find the flowers develop, the yellow flowers that we traditionally think of used in pickling products could be utilized at that point. You could still be using the dill before it reaches that maturity state. Cutting off parts of it can certainly be used in different foods that you're making. But about 40 days is when we typically expect it to flower, develop those yellow flower and the dill seeds, which could then be used for kind of pickling. The issue we've run into in the Winnebago County garden is that our dill has reseeded over and over and over again. And so it is an annual, but the issue is that those seeds are laying dormant in our winter season, and then the soil is warming up and it's popping up. So it is one that if you're thinking of it, ensure that you're keeping it from reseeding because it does have that tendency. Mint will spread via stems underground, and that's where we get that invasive quality for mint. Compare that to dill, where it just has a tendency to reseed pretty quickly, and they go into that soil bed and they're just waiting for warm soil the next year with it. There's a number of different cultivars, such as fernleaf, mammoth. Mammoth would be one that would work great in the garden. Just by that name alone, I would probably not place it in a container out of fear of the height as well as the spread that it might have. Bouquet is another one that's very common and has a nice quality to it as well, along with some other ones that are listed here too. Over the last couple of years that I've been working with Extension, we get a lot of calls about growing lavender. It is one of these herbs that a lot of people, small farms and even those that are just in the vegetable market, will typically grow. And there's a lot of folks that are interested more and more in growing lavender to use for culinary as well as fragrance and many other issues. It is one that is perennial. It is one that, depending on the cultivar, you may need to grow it in a container. It is one that can overwinter if given some of the protection that it needs. And it's also one that typically we see as a transplant or a cutting. I have seen some farmers in our growing area grow their lavender in raised beds and then providing lots of protection for it to overwinter into that next season. So you could overwinter it indoors, but if you're growing a lot of it, you may have some ability to overwinter it in a raised bed, providing some pretty good protection for it. It tends to have the strongest of flavor and aroma in the flowers, and that's typically sometimes what will be sometimes recommended for the lavender, is to kind of wait until it flowers, wait until it actually develops that flower, because that's where the strongest flavor and aroma will be. Depending on the use that you have in mind with lavender, this may make a lot of sense to you. So if you are planning to just use it in culinary uses, you may find that you don't always have to wait until that time where it flowers. But if you're going to dry it out, if you're going to use it in different ways, you may find that you need to wait until it really flowers and gets to that state. It can also benefit a bit with a rock or a pea gravel mulch. So if you have the spacing for it and area for it, you may find that that's a great place to put the lavender in place. French is a very popular and very common cultivar, rather type of lavender available to you. And you'll see that one pretty often. There's also purple ribbon, there's also lady, there's Provence, some of which have, as the name suggests, a bit of that French type to it of that cultivar. But it's a very popular one that has been increasingly seen kind of a resurgence, if you will. There's sometimes a number of lavender farms, or at least 2 or 3 I'm aware of, down in southern Illinois, where they specifically just grow lavender, along with those kind of, occasionally we see it up here and there in northern Illinois too. Basil is sometimes that quintessential summer herb. We sometimes expect as soon as the tomato plants are planted, the basil is going to go out. It's going to be planted beside them. In this photo you see is Thai basil. So we grow Thai basil in our household because we do a lot more of Vietnamese type of cooking. Basil is going to be your annual. It's going to be direct seeded, although you will find those transplants available to you as well. You will find it works great in the container if given the right space. You will also find that it works really well indoors too. You may have some success growing your basil during the summer and then bringing it indoors for a couple of weeks. Will just depend highly on how the basil is doing and how it's growing as well. There can be some adjustments here too. I shared with you on the transplant and direct seeded slide that you can do some tip cutting. So you can actually kind of cut some of the basil off and kind of develop those roots in a glass of water after at least 2 weeks and then develop into another basil plant. So that could be a really great strategy to do, and I think that's something we're going to potentially look at doing as well. It does need about 70-degree soil temperature. You may find that if you have planted your basil a couple weeks ago in May, that it has not really thrived or really taken off. And it could be that our soil was just not warm enough. That's what I have noticed with some of my vegetables, is that they have really not taken off until we entered kind of past Memorial Day. And you may find that you've encountered this as well. They really need some warm soil temperatures in order to really thrive. They also need to be sunny and just well watered throughout that season. And that's going to be an issue if you have chosen a container that contains basil, contains rosemary, contains some of those other herbs that have different watering needs and different water requirements. If it starts to kind of flower, try to pinch those tips. Will kind of encourage the plant with more leaf growth. And you can see the tips of the plant kind of in the center here of the Thai basil. If these are to start to develop, pinch them, remove them, and that should concentrate more of the leaf into developing further for you. So yes, as shared, remove the flower buds. That can also impact the flavor. So anything like that can also be a challenge that you run into when those develop. And they may develop sooner than later during this growing season too. There's going to be a number of just different types that will all be very different for certain recipes. These can include a sweet basil, Genovese, which is better usually for pesto. You will see a bush, which is usually more compact. A bush type can have some really good success in a container compared to others. This also includes purple basil, which has a very similar basil quality and flavor, but has that nice kind of flowering quality to it, or rather has a nice leaf quality to it, I should say. This will include Thai basil, which more an Asian style of cooking, cinnamon, lemon, as well as clove. A wide range of different flavors of basil that are out there for you. And yet again, all kind of gets back to what your plans are with your cooking and what you're planning to do. Some more information here about sweet basil. These are very familiar kind of sweet scented types, so they will have a nice flavor to them, but then you should also be able to have a good smell to them as well, a good fragrance, if you will, with these. The traditional Italian type also includes things such as Emily or Dolly or some other ones. The bush one, you will sometimes see described as globe. Globe is a type of bush, as we kind of imagine with a name like that. They're usually smaller, they're rounded forms. They also have smaller, finer textured foliage to them as well. Our dark basil, purple basil, has a bronze foliage to it. And in description alone, such as emerald wine or Reuben, they would have some nice qualities to them. You could use them culinary, but you could also use them as decorative in some of your planters too. Lemongrass is perennial. It has the ability to overwinter pretty well between seasons, but sometimes not always as winter hardy. It does have the ability to be grown indoors, but you're going to have to factor in how big you want that lemongrass to be. As you can imagine, transporting one of these very large lemongrasses that's reaching 2 to 3 feet tall indoors can be a bit of a challenge. So you probably want to stick more with getting a cutting of these and then overwintering that way perhaps. The stems and leaves can impart a very strong lemon flavor when cooked. You could also potentially purchase lemongrass from the grocery store, soak it in a very similar manner as you would with the basil cutting, and then you may find it roots after about 2 weeks. And yeah, I put potentially indoors question mark. I think it has the ability to do it, and it should. It's just you're going to have to play around with it because this is a very different plant than, say, rosemary or thyme or one of those other ones that would be pretty compact when brought indoors. Bay laurel is perennial. It's grown in a container. It can overwinter. It can also do really well indoors, and typically you're going to see it as a transplant. It's one that I've seen a lot more of and a lot more people have asked about in the last couple of seasons, as this has given you that traditional bay leaf that you will use in stews and in preservation and different foods. So you can grow this very little compact kind of evergreen bush indoors. I've seen it in a lot of home and garden centers this year. It is very frost sensitive, so it has to absolutely be grown in a container. Just do not even expect to try to overwinter this outdoors. You've got to grow it in a container this season, bring it indoors in that container too. Just very frost sensitive. You could apply fertilizer every 2 weeks once it's indoors, or even outdoors too would be fine. Look to also place it in full sun and kind of water when dry. So this is one where as you are watering the rosemary plants that you have, you could also probably water your bay laurel at the same time too. But very frost sensitive, needs to be grown in a container if you're expecting to overwinter it and grow it the next season. Tarragon is perennial, and it's also one that can grow really great in containers. It can overwinter in those containers then, but could also maybe even overwinter in the garden, depending on if you provide some protection through a straw mulch or through some barriers or even some leaf coverage as well. Traditionally, we see it as a transplant, and this is one where you will see French tarragon is the one that is typically recommended. We don't really recommend some of the other ones, as they don't impart that tarragon flavor that we typically expect from this. Lemon balm, perennial, could grow well in container too, or should be grown in container. It can also overwinter pretty well in that container, and then as a transplant too. It can sometimes be mistaken in its growth to mint. The main issue is that lemon balm is not going to be grown, it will not spread and be always as invasive as mint can be. For your mint, perennial, it has the ability to be grown in a container. It should be grown in a container to overwinter. It can also do great indoors. And I would say probably right now do it as a transplant. Purchase maybe a couple of plants, space them accordingly in that container. But it has major abilities to become invasive as it's growing underground stems. And it will overwinter in most successful situations, whether you want that or not. Your weed problem in your garden may be based on the mint. So we highly recommend it in a container if you can do it. You're going to find lots of different types, some of which may be stronger and better used for different recipes and different culinary plans that you have. There's a newer one on the market called Mojito, which is one, as we kind of expect, is probably going to be pretty good in some of our mojito cocktails, if you will. I know that there's a lot more other herbs out there, but I just want to kind of profile a number of those that we commonly get questions about. I'll send resources to you today that will include additional ones for your perusal to kind of help you think about what to grow or maybe what not to grow. I've created some of these ideas of themed gardens that are out there where growing a number of these different herbs can give you kind of everything you need. I think that sometimes is the issue we run into, is that we don't always know where to start. And as we think about what we might need for mostly Italian cuisine, you can see a number of ones that are listed here. If we were growing, if we were doing mostly Asian cooking or Asian style, we would do maybe the Thai basil, the lemongrass, cilantro, coriander, mint, or garlic chives even. Sometimes even that basic kitchen or the cooking staples could provide all that we're really after there, with chives, with rosemaries, with thyme. And both of these have some overlap with them as far as what the needs might be with it. And then of course the cocktail garden. What might we need for cocktails? What herbs could be utilized in cocktails? Which you see here, things such as lavender, basil, rosemary, mint, and sage might be some pretty good additions throughout it. Tea gardens have a lot of overlap sometimes with the herbs that you're growing. You'll find herbs that are used pretty commonly in different herbal tea and herbal blends there, such as lemon verbena, chocolate mint, chamomile, peppermint. We didn't talk a lot about stevia today, and stevia is a plant which you see here. This is one that tends to have a nice kind of sweet component to it. It has had a very large resurgence in the last couple of years in its growth and in the popularity of it, and I know a lot of folks that really like it. Pineapple mint is also one that could be utilized, as well as catnip. Catnip is one that has some pretty good success in a lot of the tea gardens. It tends to be pretty hardy perennial. The flowers will grow into purple spikes, and we use it a lot for tea as well as seasoning. So many of these could be those that are grown specifically in order to dry out further for your own use. And yet again, I know there's a lot more others out there as well. There is a tea plant, and this is a camellia type of variety that can be grown. You may sometimes see it called the Korean tea plant. It's a specific variety, but it's not really for our planting zone. This is more designed for planting zone 7 to 9. Some gardening catalogs do have this plant, but recognize that it's not for our zone really. Your better success with this is more of the southern US with it. Could you do it as a container? Perhaps. I don't know the growth features as well as I should here, and as it is in that family, it may be a very tall plant that maybe is not going to work well for you. For chamomile then, just to kind of talk about this one, you'll always find two types. There'll be the German and the Roman. You can technically get tea from both the Roman and the German. The issue though is that the German, which you see in this photo, will produce a lot more chamomile flowers for your use compared to the Roman. The Roman is also perennial, so it should come back year after year. It, however, has those flowers, but not as much as your German is going to. German is also typically cool season annual. It's just more commonly used for tea. But you will see both of those types. If you're thinking of more fresh use and utilizing it, lean more towards the German than the Roman. Both will have that traditional apple scent and really flavor we expect. As far as harvest then, snip sprigs and leaves as needed. That seems like a very blanket statement, and it really is. You'll find that certain herbs may actually need to get closer to that flowering stage in order to have the best flavor. And certain times, depending on what your use is of it, whether it's going to be fresh, preserved, cooking, drying, and so forth, you may find that you actually want to ensure that you're getting closer to certain growth stages as well. The best time to actually harvest these herbs is going to be mid-morning, as the oil content tends to be very high mid-morning on these. So if you're planning to, cook that day a certain ingredient or a certain recipe, and you're wanting to incorporate basil, try to cook it early in the morning, or rather snip it early in the morning, compared to snipping it in later afternoon, as the oil content will be very defined. Depending on that herb, which kind of gets back to whether it's in that mint family, if you will, or kind of that carrot family, you might, for kind of that kind of mint family that's like basil, oregano, and rosemary, you're typically going to make the cut about a few inches down the stem, just above a set of leaves. That's kind of what you're after here. Versus in some of that other family where you're going to cut each leaf stalk at the base of the plant with it. So it kind of depends on kind of that herb, and thinking about that is what really you're after here. Still factor in the herb here. You will find that the herb is really going to be kind of the main factor in how much you leave behind. A lot of times we don't see too many diseases or insect pressure on herbs. However, there is one that's pretty common now, especially in our growing area, which is downy mildew on basil, which you see in this photo. Commercially, if I'm growing commercially basil on a very large scale, we have a lot of options when it comes to dealing with downy mildew on basil. From a homeowner backyard perspective, the way that you can try to address it can be ensuring that the leaves are drying out. Making sure that your basil is getting full sun, ensuring that the basil is getting the planting space that it needs for them to dry out, for good airflow and to keep downy mildew from spreading. And then also removal of infected leaves might be another strategy that you do here too, if it's a pretty severe. If it's even a very, very severe case, you may find it's just easier just to dispose of the plant completely and throw it away. If you have flower forming much earlier than you were expecting, you may decide to pinch back, especially if it's early in the season. And this can really allow for it to focus on the leaf growth and developing those leaves with really good flavor to them. If it's later in the season, say it's now mid-August and the flowers have started to develop, you might just decide to kind of let it do its thing. And keep in mind that some herbs really need to develop that flower in order to have a good concentrated flavor that you expect. This is typically some of more of the perennial ones, such as lavender, where you'll find more of that lavender aroma and flavor that you expect based on it flowering. But certain ones you may have with it. What other issues might you run into? You could just have very poor plant vigor. The plants are not happy, they're not growing too well. Look to certain conditions. It could be you have very poor drainage in that container or in the growing area that you're growing it in. It could be that you are overwatering it based on the type of plant that you're growing. You may find that you're overwatering the rosemary and keeping the soil moist, when in fact rosemary needs it to be very dry soil. It could be that you have, very pale looking green leaves on your plant, which could be a fertility issue. It could be spacing them too close in a container or in a raised bed container. And if you've had a very long-lived perennial plant of herbs, you may find it just needs a little bit of pruning. Going in and pruning some of those woody stem herbs might be where you're after. Sometimes these strategies can be, repotting with a new growing mix between seasons. You may also decide that you need to prune and divide some of the plants that you're growing here too. And then it might even be moving that container if you have the ability. It could be it's not getting enough sun. It could be that it's in a place where it's getting much more rainfall and rainwater than it needs. It could be that you just need to factor in that it needs more airflow. And by moving that container could allow for better airflow to help with it. You also want to consider, making sure the growing mix is drying out if it needs to, or that it's not drying out. What I mean here is if basil is really thriving in moist soil and it's staying too dry, that could be why the basil plant is not doing as well for you as it could be. If worse comes to worse, you may also find that you need to apply a low dosage of fertilizer. On that fertility slide that I shared with you, you may find just a little bit of fertility can really go a long way when it comes to ensuring that your plants are really thriving. So I'm starting to get wrapped up today. So if you've got any additional questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box because we will have time to get to a lot of them. I will always send these resources to you in an email today. So you will get these and links to each of them. But just to mention a couple of these, we still maintain a very nice website through our extension service on herb gardening. It provides a good overview of growing herbs. While some of the cultivars and varieties that are listed are a little bit dated, if you will, there's a lot of really good information in here when it comes to the basics of growing herbs, as well as overwintering some of these and the challenges you may run into and the recommendations that we have. A number of other friends of the universities, University of Minnesota, as well as University of Missouri, have two very good publications that have recently been released in the last couple of years that go into more overview on some of the herbs that I did not mention today, particularly this Missouri Extension Guide. It is an encyclopedia kind of document of a lot of different herbs that are out there. In Illinois, we have the Illinois Herb Association, and this group of commercial growers as well as homeowners and just herb enthusiasts is very active throughout the growing season and throughout the year. And I've provided a link for them because if you are an herb enthusiast and you're not a part of this group, you might look to actually become part of them. Some of the recommendations for the tea garden come from Washington State University. And then I would be remiss if I did not mention some of the food and nutrition wellness educators have a lot of great herb recipes of using herbs, of storing herbs, and preserving herbs. As I am more of the grower, I tend to lean more heavily on those that have more experience when it comes to preserving and using them. And so I will provide links to what the three bottom ones that you see there, provided by some of our nutrition and wellness educators. So as we get wrapped up today, really consider your family's herb needs this season. I think it's very crucial to think about what you might need on a weekly basis, as some of these can make a lot of sense for you versus those that maybe I need to plant much more than I really recognized and really realized. Really be mindful of an herb's needs. I think this is where you're going to have the most success, is that be very considerate and try not to generalize as much about what that herb's needs might be, because that may be where you're having some poor success. It's also important to recognize that you may have overwintered an herb from the previous season and it's just not doing well for you. And there could be a challenge in there in the overwintering that really happened. As much as we had a more mild winter this year, it still was a pretty wet spring, and it still has been a very cold spring for things to be coming back. And there could be some issues we've run in there as well. Plan for overwintering now. I think that's what I've really tried to think about when it comes to my herb growing, is that there's going to be certain ones that could grow great in my raised bed situation. There's other ones that just need to go ahead and be in a container because I want to see if I can overwinter them. Be mindful of invasive tendencies of an herb. Mint and dill have a quality of becoming invasive. There's a lot of other ones out there that can do this as well. And when I mean invasive here, I'm saying that they just spread and they kind of go wild. So you're hoping they're going to stay in one area, and yet neither one of them can sometimes do that. As always, experiment. Try out new cultivars, try out different varieties, grow in different things. The benefit with herb growing is that, you've got ability to do this. So you will get an evaluation in your email today, but you can also, take a photo of your camera phone, and that will take you to an evaluation link. If you have any photos or any issues that you're dealing with herbs, I'm more than happy to take photos via my email there. We also do a lot of work on our Facebook and tend to highlight some of the resources out there, as well as any kind of webinars or resources you have and need. You can also reach me at that phone number as well, which you see here. So with that, we've got some time for some questions, so I'm going to take those and go from there. All right. Let's see. All right, so we've got a question that was about, all right to put fertilizers on herbs. So Carol, this question about fertilizers, I do a reduced rate if you could. I wouldn't be fertilizing as much as your other vegetables. Some of your vegetables that you grow in the garden, they're needing to develop that fruit that season, that tomato, that pepper. So they really need a lot more fertility than your herbs. You saw that slide, just kind of be a little bit mindful of too much fertility with it. Question, can you use some type of herbs as perennial ground cover too? You certainly could, Deborah. I think something like some of the chives would work really well. You will find that some of the thyme plants can also spread out and do really well. I would not treat mint as a ground cover. I think you're going to have a really poor time with that one. But there's going to be a number of herbs out there, lemongrass even, which may have the ability to overwinter, could work really well too. As some ground cover. So you'll find a lot of good ones out there that have some nice tendencies to be a good ground cover compared to maybe those that could get a little invasive. And I should mention that chives can occasionally get invasive here too. All right, pest and herb. Which herbs do pests hate? Which do they love? I'd like to keep them away from lots of chipmunks, gophers, voles, and not invite them. I think you're going to find some pretty good success with most of these, being kind of repellent for pests. There is some guidance out there that sometimes rosemary as well as basil can sometimes be a very good companion plant to keeping them from getting to certain ones. But because of their aromatic tendencies and the quality of them, I think most are going to be pretty much okay with and keep being a problem here. I don't think they're going to like them too much. When it comes to maybe newly planted ones, that may be where you have an issue. So for instance, if you are just starting to get some germination of parsley or cilantro, you may find that rabbits come in and eat those based on kind of their leaf tissue there. Why is it so difficult to grow rosemary and lavender from seed? Are there tips that you can give us to grow these herbs from seed? It's a good question, Shelley, and I need to do a little bit more research on it because I wonder if both rosemary and lavender need to have some kind of cold stratification, if you will, where they need to be in kind of a cold climate to break that seed up before they can actually be grow and do well for you there. Sometimes it's that when it comes to certain seeds. I just don't know if rosemary and lavender are that case, or I just don't know if the availability is there just yet. I need to do a little bit more research. I think I've got your email, Shelley, or if you want to email me, Shelley, we can talk a little bit more about that. I want to think that it's maybe a cold situation where they need to have some cold climate in a refrigerator or something before they can germinate properly. Question, should I be cutting my chives back during the season? So yeah, you might need to do that a little bit. I think especially those kind of clumps of chives that you might be handling and dealing with, you may want to cut back. I think it's going to get back to your landscaping quality and how you feel about this, because they should recover pretty well because they're going to try to really kind of thrive and grow. These chive plants will. So you might decide to cut them back some as you use them, or you may even decide to kind of divide them up if you could and remove some of those clumps. So there's a question we have, are fresh herbs stronger flavored than dried herbs? Typically they are. So when we think about actually using a fresh herb compared to dry herb, typically we'll use 1 tablespoon of a fresh herb compared to 1 teaspoon of a dry herb. So it's a pretty big difference here. How would you dry the dill weed? I would probably dry the dill weed out kind of hanging it up. I tend to take the cuttings there. I might dry them in paper bags as an option too. So either direction is probably what I would do. I'd probably do some cuttings of drying the dill weed in a paper bag and kind of hang it up that way, or I might individually dry the dill weed out that direction. I know one of our nutrition educators gets a little more into it in one of the resources I will send you to. Question. This is my first year to try growing basil. My cinnamon basil plants look like they want to vine. Should I provide a trellis for them? They were purchased transplants, just plant them. You might be able to get away with a trellis for them or need to. I don't necessarily think you do based on how big of a stem that cinnamon basil and some of the basil plants tend to be. I don't think it's going to hurt if you did that, if you provide some support for them, but you just may not need to do that. Question, can you use fresh bay leaves in a recipe or do you need to dry them first? This is a great question, Bobby. I'm not entirely sure. I think you might be able to use them, but I don't know if they are going to impart that same kind of flavor that we typically expect from the dry bay leaves itself. That's just what I'm not sure about. I think you probably could, but I just don't know if it's going to be so overpowering compared to if you were to dry it out in the first place. You may also find if that recipe perhaps is saying 2 to 3 dry bay leaves in a recipe, you're probably just going to need 1 bay leaf in that recipe too. Question, is green onion considered a vegetable and not an herb? So this is a good question, Deborah, and as I look through some of our resources, because you will find herbs that will mention green onion, or they may mention garlic as an herb. What we kind of see with those vegetables being used as herbs, they're not the full meal, correct? So it's not as if I am just making a meal that's just green onions. I'm usually finishing my meal with green onions, and it's just the top of it or the part of it that you're using the green onions. So by some definitions, a green onion is an herb because it's just being an additional ingredient like you would any of these other herbs. But you may find that recipe is just green onion, and now it's more of a vegetable. So it kind of varies based on that definition. Question, any suggestion for using chocolate mint? A lot of times the chocolate mint can just be replaced in a lot of any other things that might require mint. I don't necessarily think I'm going to use it in any fresh drinks, but you may find that any substitution or any recommendations of using mint in any baked goods or anything like that might be useful. I've not cooked with it, so I can't really make too much of a suggestion on it at this time, though. Question, can stevia be overwintered in the soil? I would try to overwinter it, but I might see about actually having it in a container. I just don't think, based on its leaf structure, that it's going to overwinter really well if it does, if it is grown outdoors. Rosemary, some of these hardy woody stem plants can sometimes be okay with overwintering. I just don't think stevia is going to have that potential. And I think it's one where you might be able to go between seasons in a container. I just don't know it as well enough as I can be. Question, what low dosage fertilizer do you recommend for herbs? So I would probably see if you could find a 5-5-5, so 5% nitrogen, 5% potassium, 5% phosphorus. Something like that might be a pretty good solution for that fertilizer. And then you might cut in half that recommendation of what they're suggesting. So if they're saying that, maybe 3 teaspoons of this 5-5-5, you might just do 1 teaspoon of that 5-5-5 for it. And yet again, kind of factor in, is the plant exhibiting this, and depending on the growth of the plant too, and where it's at. Question, dividing chives, should I just dig them up and plant smaller clumps? I have had these in one clump for probably 20 years. They always come back just fine. I didn't even realize they might need dividing. This is kind of up to you, Deb. If you find that it is very kind of overpowering, if you find that the vigor of the chives is not where you'd like it to be, this might be where that dividing could actually be quite beneficial. I think in most cases, you're probably going to be okay to do some division this season. I think you're probably going to be okay with that, and the plant should kind of recover. So maybe starting around the edges of that chive area could work for you. But that again is it showing some issues? Is it that it's spreading too far? Something like that might be where you're at with it. And yes, that would be just kind of digging them up, kind of planting them in smaller little clumps with it. I think one of the resources that I'll send out will include some information on this. Question, will your slides for this presentation be online anywhere? I joined late and missed a few slides. Yes, so you should be able to find, I sent an email about 7:30 this morning where you will find that, but I will make sure that that's in the email that goes out this afternoon again, just so you know where to download the presentation. Question, do you recommend indoor plant grow lights for indoor herbs in the winter? If you don't necessarily have, say, a south-facing window, I would look towards having some indoor grow lights if you can. You may be able to get away with a west-facing window or even an east-facing window and get the sunlight and the light that you really need. But I think you're going to find that these herbs, especially an herb like basil that maybe needs full sun and thrives in full sun, is not going to get enough sunlight during the winter time. And you might consider kind of getting some additional grow lights to kind of help it with it. You will see a lot of DIY kits out there of making your own grow lights. You will also find that there are some new ones that are LED that can provide this too. But I would look towards that. If you don't have maybe a south-facing window, or say that east or west-facing windows as well as you'd like. Question, can I overwinter container growing rosemary in my garden, in my garage as a dormant, semi-dormant? I don't have the light I need to overwinter in my house. And I think you can, Daviess. I think it's going to go into some dormancy here when it comes to it. I don't think you're going to need, that 10 to 12 hours that some of these typical plants maybe are going to need to be enhanced. You would probably need to water it pretty intermittently, and I would also try to prune it back in the spring. There is some suggestion for rosemary, thyme, and some of the others to actually move it into a growing media mix in a new container when you overwinter it that is more of a cacti citrus mix. And you see this mix pretty commonly at home and garden centers in usually an orange bag, and that might be a pretty good strategy to kind of help with it. But my thought is it's going to go into dormancy. I think you would be probably okay in that garage situation. Japanese beetles love basil. Yeah. So yes, that would be something to consider too, is, some of these herbs maybe are going to attract a lot more pests than you want with it. All right, so I've got a little bit after 11:30, so I think we'll get wrapped up here. Some of you all had some really kind of narrow questions, and so if you want to talk a little bit more, please feel free to email me with some of these issues. I think we can talk some of these out, but sometimes it just really helps to make sure that we get you the right information for overwintering. And this may be a topic that you think about closer to it as well too. All right, so thank you. This is our final Get Growing webinar series. I hope you enjoyed a lot of it. It's sunny where I'm located, so I hope you're able to get out this weekend and enjoy herb gardening and vegetable gardening this season. Whew.